Hi everybody, I'm Dave Thomas, and today I'm going to show how to build this 3-motor cluster assembly. This is made by Rocketarium and is included in many of their kits, but you can also buy it as its own kit for use in your rockets. By itself it uses friction fit for motor retention simply because it's a very tight fit to put this into a BT-60 tube, which it's designed for. And so if I take a BT-60 like this and slide that in, there's not a lot of place in there for a standard motor clip type of retainer. And so Rocketarium simply suggests using a little masking tape around the motors to friction fit those in. What I'll show you here is, first of all, the build as instructed that gives you a motor mount like this, and then also how to improve motor retention by putting in some threaded rod. The cluster motor mount comes with its own instructions here, and it's relatively straightforward. There's no engine retaining clip. This has to use friction fit for the motors simply because there isn't enough room to put clips in here. And so our first task is to install the thrust rings. These are a little bit smaller than standard ones in terms of their total thickness. And we're going to put these in the very tips here of each motor tube. Now we don't want to get too much glue down inside that might interfere with the motors, so I'm going to use an applicator here and put some just along the very edge. Okay, and then I'm going to put this in, just so, and then I'm going to put this down on a hard surface that I don't mind getting glue on, like the instructions here. Okay, and then just wipe off the excess glue there. And again, we just don't want any to drip down inside the tube. And then you can set this aside and do the other two. I am going to do that off camera. I've let these set for a good 5 minutes or so, and I'm using wood glue. If you're using white glue, I would let these dry for 10 to 15 minutes before handling them again. And our next task is to simply glue the tubes to each other, making sure that you've got the thrust ring on the same end all the way through. So I'm going to start by simply making a line of glue here. And then taking one of the other tubes and attaching that lengthwise like this. And then the third tube is going to go on top of the tube, and all of these are going to line up parallel. Okay, so if you kind of take a look here from one side, that gives me a little bit of an idea of where the next pieces of glue need to go. So I'm going to put a line of glue about here. And another line at about here. And if I need to, I can add more glue later. Okay, and again, making sure I've got all the thrust rings on the same end. I'm just going to put these together. Okay, so I can see a nice glue seam there and a nice one there. That one's a little off. Okay, but not too much. So if I want to, I could just take some more glue here, and I'm going to do this as a demonstration on this one, and just work it down in there. So if you don't think you've got a good seam, go ahead and work a little more glue down in there. Okay, and I'm going to just make sure that everything is level there. And a little bit of glue outside the seam's okay, but we don't want it up here on the outer edges. I'm just going to clean it off just to be sure. Okay, now we've got a little bit of incongruity here. I'm going to pull this apart just a little bit. Put that back. is we do want all of these to be even with each other. Okay, and now I'm going to set this aside and let it dry for 10 to 15 minutes before we apply it to the centering ring. My glue has set up enough that I can work with it here. And so our next task is to glue this retaining ring onto the front of our cluster here. Now, they don't go through. In this case, the retaining ring, or the centering ring, acts as an additional engine block or thrust ring here. And so we're not trying to put the tubes through this. So here I'm going to get some more glue. Okay, and I'm just going to put this around each ring. Again, we don't want to get glue down inside the motor mount tubes. If you get a little inside the thrust rings, that's fine. Alright, and then we're going to place this in line. Okay, so we need, first of all, we need to be in line with all of the tubes there, and then we want to check the outside and make sure that the edges of all of our motor tubes are flush with the edge of our centering ring here, and that looks like it's pretty good. Okay, so I'm just going to let this dry now for a good several hours before going on to the next part that involves this. After you have the basic cluster kit assembled here, you'll need a few other things to improve your retention. One of those is some size 440 threaded rod or a 440 threaded screw, and this is going to need to be at least 3 inches long. And we'll get to exact measurements here in just a bit. You may have some trouble finding this. My local hardware stores only carry down to number 8 threaded rods, nothing below that. And a number 6 threaded rod looks like it'll do it, but I actually tried this with a number 6 and it's just a little bit too thick. So you have to have the 440 or the metric equivalent. You'll also need 2 nuts, 2 number 4 washers, and then a number 6 washer there. Okay. Most of this you can get at a hardware store. Like I said, the hard part might be finding the long 440 screw here. I ultimately found this on Amazon. So the first thing we need to do is put a hole in the middle of the centering ring here. Now in the kit it has a small hole here, presumably for putting in a screw eye for an anchor point for a Kevlar cord. But in this case we need to drill it out just a little bit larger, and so we need this threaded rod to be able to pass through that hole. So I'm going to take this off camera, drill the hole, and then come back. Now in order to leave enough room on both ends of our threaded rod here, this needs to be about 8.5 millimeters, or excuse me, 8.5 centimeters. So I'm just going to mark this with a Sharpie. Alright, and if you are not metrically inclined, it's going to be about 3 3/8 inches. Okay. And then you just need to use whatever device you have to cut this at that mark. In my case, I'm using the screw cutter on my electrical stripping tool here. So just screw that down to my mark, and then I just need to cut that. Okay, now that's the extra piece, we don't want it. Okay, so our remaining piece will fit in here, just like that. Okay, and so we're going to put on a nut here, and if it doesn't want to go on, oh, this one does quite nicely. Sometimes you get the cut edge will get a little bit gummed up there. It might be hard to get the nut on. In that case, you can take it on from the other direction. Alright, and I'm going to take one of my number 4 washers and slide that on there. Okay, and so that's going to act as a stop now. And then down here, we'll put on, first of all, the larger washer, the number 6. Alright, then the smaller washer, and then the other nut. Now in the field, you're going to want to be careful changing this because it's going to be really easy to lose these small parts. You want to keep some spares with you. If you can find it, you might be able to use a small wing nut here too, although you do have to be careful that the wings of the wing nut don't interfere with the motor propulsion and the exhaust gas that's coming out of them. Okay, so this is just a dry fit to see how everything goes together. And now you can either use wood glue or epoxy to basically seal this whole thing in. Epoxy is going to be stronger, although these are not going to be anything bigger than a D-impulse motor in here. So that's not too much of a problem. It's going to be easier cleanup to use wood glue. It's also going to be a little bit lighter. Okay, so in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and pull this out. And you're going to want a damp rag or paper towels handy. And then we're simply going to take some wood glue and run that down into the space between the motors. Okay. Well, we've got a decent amount of glue down in here. And so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a fairly good glob of glue right at my hole here and around it. Alright, I'm going to push this down through. Okay, so now I've got a big glob of glue here. And this is what we want our damp paper towel or rag for. Because we want to clean off those threads completely. If you're doing this with epoxy, you'll want to have some paint thinner handy to do this same job, to remove epoxy from the threads. Okay. Make sure that I've got a little bit of screw thread extended up on the forward end, and I'm going to cover that a blob of glue. You could also use thread lock here or epoxy. And the general idea is that even though the glue is not going to stick directly to the metal, it will get inside the threads there and lock it in place. Okay. And go ahead and put all of the hardware on the other end. Okay, I just want this snug just to make sure that the screw's not rattling around inside there. And now I'm going to let this glue dry for a good hour or two, and when I come back I'll show how the motors will fit in this and how this screw mechanism actually keeps them there. Now that my glue has dried, I've taken off the outer hardware here, and just to show you how this is all going to go together, I've got some spent engine casings here, and so those will just fit in here like this. Alright, and this is why we wanted a little bit extra extension out here on the aft end, is so that it clears the engines. And then we put the bigger washer on, and then the smaller washer, and they like to go everywhere. And again, I recommend that if you're doing this in the field, carry some extra washers and nuts. Okay, and then the nut goes on to hold the whole thing in. Right, here I'm just going to finger tighten it. You'll actually want a small wrench handy. Okay, now my big washer is a little off center, but that's fine, it's doing its job. So it's holding each of those motors in place and preventing them from being able to go backwards. Okay, once you got the whole thing done, you can obviously take the motors out and mount this into whatever rocket tube that you're going to use. So it would simply go in like this. Okay, and that's what it would look like on a finished rocket tube. One thing to keep in mind, this does add a little bit of mass to the back end of the rocket. Depending on your exact combination of hardware, this adds between about 2.5 to 3 grams. So if this is on an already fairly large rocket, it's probably going to be negligible. But do be sure to either run a simulation in software or just do a swing test and check the stability of your rocket with this new hardware in place. Alright, I hope this has been helpful for you, and please stay tuned for my next video.